A greengrocer was visited daily by a little boy who would take the overripe fruit that could no longer be sold. One day, the greengrocer decided to follow the boy to find out why. Times were hard, and as everyone knows, a dollar doesn't stretch far, especially for the very poor. For families struggling to put food on the table, fresh fruits and vegetables were often considered luxuries. Mr. Lewis, the greengrocer, understood this well. He had been through tough times himself and knew what it was like to go hungry. That's why Mr. Lewis had a box at the front of his store filled with produce that was slightly overripe and unsellable. He made it available for anyone in need. Most of the people who took from the charity box, as he called it, were elderly or overburdened mothers trying to feed their families. One day, Mr. Lewis saw a little boy watching as an old woman took some tomatoes and oranges from the box. The boy, curious, asked, "Aren't you mad?" Mr. Lewis smiled. "Why would I be mad?" "But you get mad when boys try to steal apples," the boy said. "That's true," Mr. Lewis replied, "but this is different. This fruit needs to be eaten right away before it goes bad, so I let people who can't afford to buy it take it." The boy hesitated before asking, "Can I have some too?" "Of course, son," Mr. Lewis said gently. "What's your name?" "I'm Peter," the boy answered. "Peter," Mr. Lewis said. "Wait here a minute." He went into the store and came back with a strong bag filled with a variety of fruit from the charity box. "Here you go," he said. "Enjoy, and come back anytime you need more." Peter thanked him and ran off with the bag of fruit. The next day, Peter returned with his own bag and politely asked if he could take some fruit again. Off he ran with his treasure, and this soon became a daily routine. Sometimes Mr. Lewis even added fresh produce to Peter's bag. Curious about the boy, Mr. Lewis decided to follow him one afternoon. He watched from a distance as Peter approached a shabby-looking house, left a bag of fruit on the porch, and ran off. Mystified, Mr. Lewis continued to follow him to another equally poor-looking house. This time, Peter opened the door and yelled, "Mom, I'm home." Realizing Peter wasn't keeping any of the fruit for himself, Mr. Lewis decided to ask the boy about it the next day. "Peter," he asked gently, "what do you do with the food you take? Do you give it to your mom?" Peter shook his head. "No," he said. "I take it to my grandmother's house. She's looking after my little cousin, but doesn't have much money because she's out of work. My mom tries to help, but my grandmother won't accept it. She says my mom has her own family to feed. So I leave the food on her porch, so she doesn't know it's from me." Tears welled up in Mr. Lewis' eyes. "Don't you ever take anything for yourself?" he asked. Peter hung his head. "I did once," he confessed. "You put a shiny red apple in the bag, and I kept it. But afterward, I felt bad because Sally needs it more than me." "Does your mom know?" Mr. Lewis asked. Peter shook his head again. "No. She's very proud, and she'd be ashamed to know I took charity." "Wait here a minute," Mr. Lewis said. He went into the store and returned with 2 large bags filled with fresh fruits and vegetables. Together, they delivered 1 bag to Peter's grandmother's house and left it on the porch. Then Mr. Lewis accompanied Peter home. When Peter's mom answered the door, Mr. Lewis introduced himself. "I own the greengrocer on Barton Avenue. Peter has been helping me after school, and since he won't take any money, I decided to pay him in goods." He handed her the second bag. Mrs. Dean was stunned. "Peter didn't tell me," she said, her voice breaking. "He's a good boy," Mr. Lewis said. "I only wish he were 10 or 12 years older." "Why?" Mrs. Dean asked. "I want to open another shop a few streets over and need hardworking people to run it," Mr. Lewis explained. "Would you be interested?" "Yes," Mrs. Dean exclaimed. "I would. I always hire 2 employees," Mr. Lewis said. "Can you recommend someone?" "My mother," Mrs. Dean replied. "She's hardworking and needs a job. She's raising my brother's daughter." "Excellent," Mr. Lewis said. "The shop opens in a month." True to his word, Mr. Lewis opened the new shop. Peter's mother and grandmother became his employees, earning good salaries. They turned out to be excellent workers and carried on Mr. Lewis' tradition of providing a charity box for those in need. If they sometimes slipped a needy customer a fresh bag of apples or potatoes, Mr. Lewis didn't mind.